Hi, this is Jessica with cutesy-crafts.com. Today I've got a tutorial to show you how to sew things by hand. And you can do almost anything without a sewing machine that you would need to for sewing. So these are, for example, sewing two pieces of fabric together, or if you have a ripped seam or something. And then even if you need to hem something like pants or curtains, there's different hand stitches that you can do for that as well. So whether you don't have a sewing machine or you don't feel like breaking it out at the moment, I will teach you how to sew by hand using just a needle and thread. You'll need some all-purpose sewing thread, and normally you would want to get a thread that exactly or very closely matches your fabric so that it doesn't show. But for today's purposes, so that I can show you all of the stitches, I'm going to be using a contrasting color thread. These are some sharp fabric scissors I have for cutting the thread, and I also have some bigger ones for cutting fabric. You'll need some needles, of course. These are just some all-purpose hand sewing needles. A bigger one you would use for thicker fabrics, and then smaller ones for thinner, finer fabrics. You can use sewing pins if you would like to hold the fabric together, but these are not necessary depending on what kind of project you're doing. I've also got a ruler, which is also optional, and a marking pen. This is just my friction pen that I like to use because it disappears with heat. You can use any kind of fabric marking pen that will disappear. The first step in sewing is going to be to thread your needle. So you want to take about the length from your hand up to your shoulder and then snip off that amount. Now, threading a needle can be trickier for some people than others. If you really have a hard time with it, I recommend trying out some needle threaders. I have a link in the description to a whole review on different needle threaders that I tested out. But the best way to do it without a needle threader is to get a clean cut, and then you need to either lick your thread or get it wet with some water. And then just do your best to line that up. Once you've got that through, go ahead and pull it about 5 inches through. And then you're going to let that go the same direction as the long part of your thread. And then in the longer end of our thread down here, we're going to tie a knot. So just make a loop and put the tail end through, tie a knot, and then I like to double knot it to make a bigger knot. So now I've got my two pieces of fabric that I want to sew together, and this can be representative of a seam that came out in clothing or just a pattern that you're following. So the way that we would do this is what's called right sides together. So say this is the pretty side of my fabric with whatever design I want on it. You would put the right side and the right side together. Right side meaning the side with the print on it. And then the other side of the fabric is called wrong side. So I put that together, and then we're going to sew a seam along this edge here. And I'm going to actually mark the seam so that I get a straight line about a 1/2 inch in. So if a pattern or something says to have a 1/2 inch seam, that's what it means, is that you'll be sewing a 1/2 inch in from the edge. So now if you want to prevent slipping, you can also pin. And that just keeps everything in place while you're sewing, so you don't have to worry about it. Now there's different kinds of stitches that you can do to make this seam. I'm going to start with showing you a basic running stitch. So again, we have our thread with a knot at the end, and we're going to start up close to the top edge, but not so close that it's going to rip through the fabric and rip off of there. So I'm going to pull my needle up to the front. So I've got my knot back here catching it. And then I'm going to go forward about 1/4 inch. You can decide how long or short you want to make your stitches. The longer the stitches are, the easier they are to take out. And I feel like shorter stitches are a little bit more neat and secure. So you can see I went forward about 1/4 inch, put my needle back down in, and then I'm going to go ahead and pull that down. So then I'm going to come up from the back with my needle, the same length forward, and pull the thread up through. And then go forward again, the same length, and push that through to the back. And you don't want to pull too tight, otherwise it's going to cause your fabric to pucker. So just do nice even stitches and give it a little tug, but not too tight when you're stitching. So this is a good stitch to use while hand sewing if the part of whatever you're sewing isn't going to get a lot of wear and tear. It's the quickest stitch to get two pieces of fabric together. And you can do really long stitches, and that is actually better for what's called basting. And basting is when you temporarily sew two pieces of fabric together when you're gonna like machine stitch them later. And the longer stitches just make it easier to take out afterwards because it's not permanent. Another way to do this, especially if you want it to go faster or if it's just temporary, is to sew the stitch, which would be bringing the needle up and then back down, and then you can bring it up and then back down like that. And that just saves you time while stitching, and then you made two stitches there. Do one last stitch and then turn the fabric over, and you can see it should look pretty similar to how it looks on the front. And I'm gonna take my needle and go under this last stitch here in the back. So you can see I'm just going underneath that stitch of thread there, and leave a little loop on top, and then bring your needle through that loop to tie a knot. Just give it a little bit of a tug, and then we're gonna do that one more time. Make a double knot to make sure that it's secure. Go ahead and snip that off, and you have successfully made a seam with a running stitch. And that holds together pretty nicely. So the running stitch is nice, but if you want something a little bit more sturdy and more similar to what a sewing machine would do, we can do what's called a back stitch. So I've got another piece of fabric here, prepared just the same as our previous one. And then I've got my thread with a knot tied again at the end. So this is gonna start out just like the running stitch. We're gonna bring our needle up from the back. The knot catches it there. We're gonna go about 1/4 of an inch forward again. Do one stitch length forward, and then we're gonna bring our needle up the same length, about 1/4 of an inch away as that first stitch. And then instead of going forward like we did for the running stitch, you're gonna take your needle and go back into the same hole that the previous stitch went down in. And that's why we call this one the back stitch. So again, one stitch length forward, and then back into the spot that the previous stitch is coming up in. Stitch length forward, and then back to the previous stitches. This takes a little bit more time than the running stitch, but gives you results that look a lot more like what a sewing machine would produce. You can also do a little bit more of a sewing rather than stabbing method for this. And for that, you would just put the needle down in the spot that the previous thread was coming up, and then bring it up the 1/4 of an inch away down here. And that just makes it go a little bit faster, like that. And once you get to the end, turn your work over and you'll see that the front looks a little bit different from the back. But we're gonna take our needle and thread, and again, we're gonna go under this last stitch, and I'm running out of thread here, but leave a little bit of a loop. Put the needle through the loop and then pull to tie a knot. And then do that one last time. Leave a little loop and pull that through, and that will give you a double knot on the back to make it secure. You can trim that off. And you've got a nice secure back stitch that wouldn't be showing at all here had we used the same color as our fabric. So those are the two most common ways that you would sew just a regular straight hem. Sometimes when you're sewing, you'll sew around the fabric and then leave a small opening to turn it. And this happens a lot when you're making like stuffed things, like say a pillow or a stuffed animal or something like that. So now you've got it turned right side out, but you have this opening that needs to be sewn shut. So you want to do that in a way that your stitches are still not going to show. And to do that, we'll use something called a slip stitch. So for that, you would want to fold in the excess fabric here that would be on your raw edge of your fabric. You want that to be on the inside, just like the rest of the hems. And normally I would go then and iron this. And then I've got my needle again prepared with just a few inches pulling through one side. And then on the longer side, I've got a knot tied. So the first thing we're gonna wanna do is open up that hem there. We're gonna take the needle up inside the fold and bring it out on the fold line. So you can see it's coming out right there on the fold. And bring that up, and then the knot's gonna catch on the inside. So the next thing you wanna do is take your needle across the hole here that we're sewing up, push it down into the top of the fold, and then we're just gonna grab a little bit of the fabric traveling along that fold line. So you can see that there. And the travel happens inside the fabric so that you don't see the thread. And then pull that through. And then once you pull that, you're just left with a tiny little stitch right there that again, we wouldn't see if we were using the matching thread color. So from this side, I'm gonna go back across to the other side of the hole, travel to the left about 1/4 of an inch under that fold, and then pull that through. So then you would just keep going back and forth, again across to the other side, go about 1/4 of an inch and along that fold there, and then pull that across. So continue that along the entire hole, and then you'll have nice hidden stitches. And once you have gotten to the end here, you can go to the opposite side, grab a little bit of that fabric there. Again, making sure nothing is coming on this side of the fold. We're working in that fold the entire time. I'm gonna pull that and then leave a loop, and then take my needle up through the loop, pull that, and that gives us the beginning of a knot. And then do that one more time in the same spot, if you can. And that will give you a double knot. And then to hide our tail here, just go ahead and poke the needle down through the fabric and then bring it up in the seam over here. Give that a little tug and then cut this excess off as close to the fabric as possible. And that gives you a nice invisible way to seal up an opening in some fabric using the slip stitch. So now say you have like some pants or some curtains or something like that that you want to create a hem for. So now I'm going to show you a few different ways to do that. So if we want to do a hem along this bottom edge here, this raw edge, we would fold it up about 1/4 of an inch and then fold it up however much more you want that hem to be. So if you wanted a really long hem, say on curtains or something, you could do like up to 4 inches, or if you want to leave a little bit of room for if you need to let down a pair of pants, you can make this part bigger. But for these purposes, I'm just going to fold it up about another 1/2 inch, 1/4 of an inch, and then press that with an iron. And then I've got my needle prepared with a knot on the end. And the first stitch I'm going to show you how to do is called a whip stitch. So for that, you would start the needle by bringing it up through the top of this folded part right here. And then the knot will catch it in the back. And so I've got nothing on this side. That's all on the inside here. So then we're going to come at an angle from where we brought this up. I'm going to catch just the tiniest bit of thread right there, maybe like 1 or 2 threads, and then bring that through. So you can see I've got this angle going here. And then the needle would come through and catch on the fold here. and go through there. So normally I would do that all in one motion, but just for the demonstration purposes, I wanted to show you where the thread's going. So again, we're gonna come at an angle from this spot here, catch just the tiniest little bit of thread here, and then turn, and then come up through the fold right there. Pull that through, and one last time, an angle to the left, catch some thread, then turn, and bring your needle through the fold here. So the whip stitch has this distinct angled look like that, and then on the front, I just have these tiny itty bitty stitches here that you wouldn't even notice if it had been the same color thread that I'm using. So then just continue that along the length of the hem until you get to the end. And then to finish that off, just take your needle through the fold part right here. Bring that through, leave a loop, put the thread through the loop, tie that off, and then go under that little stitch that was created again. Leave a loop, go through that loop, and then tie a knot. And then to hide that, I'm gonna bring my needle down in the fold here, bring it up inside the fold, and then cut off as close to the fabric as I can, and then it'll disappear. And that's how you would sew a whip stitch. Another way to sew a hem is what's called a blind hem stitch, and we can actually do this on a sewing machine, but I'm gonna show you how to do it by hand. So I've got my fabric folded up 1/4 of an inch, and then again, however big or small you want that hem to be. And then you'll wanna press that for optimal results. Thread your needle with a knot on the end, and bring your needle up through the fold to start out with. Then we're going to bring the needle directly across to the fabric up here and grab just a couple of threads, run that through, then come back to this spot where we came up out of the fold, just a little bit further away from it. And then we're going to, kind of like the slip stitch, we're going down into this fold here only, and we're going to travel the needle along the fold about 1/4 of an inch. So you can see I've just got a tiny stitch up here, and the traveling of the needle is happening inside the fold there. So pull that through, and then again go from this fold up, catch a couple of threads, and then we're going back down to this fold, travel the needle about 1/4 of an inch, and then pull that through. And then just continue doing that until you get to the end of your hem. And then when you get to the end, you can do one last little grab of your fabric there, and then go through one more time, but this time leave a loop, pull your needle through that loop, and then tie a knot, and then do that one more time with a loop to tie a knot. And then to hide that tail, you can just bring the needle only through the fold there. Bring that down, and then snip that off. So you can see the blind hem leaves barely anything on front. Matching thread would mean you wouldn't see anything, and also on the back. Now sometimes for a hem, you want a bit of a decorative stitch. So I'm going to show you what's called a blanket stitch. This is frequently done on the edge of a blanket, and that's why it's given that name. So to start out with, for the blanket stitch, I'm going to take my needle and bring my needle up through the fold at the bottom there, and that's just to hide my knot. So then we're going to go up and then to the left, so at an angle. And we want it to be about the same distance from here to here as there is from here to here. So if I've got like a 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch here, that's how far I want to go from there to there to create kind of like a square. Hopefully that makes sense. So bring your needle down at the top of the fold, not through the fold, just at the top of it. And then don't pull that all the way through. Now remember what we're gonna do is my needle is coming from the back here. I'm gonna bring it around and put it through that loop to catch the fabric, and that'll create this sort of L shape here. So then do the same thing. I am now starting with my thread coming out down here. So we're gonna go up and at an angle to the left there. Pull that down. But before that pulls all the way through, bring my needle through the loop to catch it. And then kind of pull it off to the left a little bit. The first stitches will be a little wonky, but once you get the hang of it, it'll turn out fine. So then the same length over here as we've been doing. And then bring your needle up through that loop to catch it. And so just continue that until you get to the end of your hem. And you can see that's leaving a nice line along the edge here. And then the front and the back should look the same. So once you get to the end, take your needle and put it under the last stitch. Leave a loop, pull the thread through that loop, and so it's going to kind of tie a knot at the end there, and then do that a second time. And then you can take the needle, put it through the fold, so we're traveling inside the fold there to hide the thread. And then just snip that off as close to the fabric as you can. And that's how you would hem using a blanket stitch. I hope this tutorial was helpful in showing you that you can sew things without using a sewing machine and still get really good results. Head over to my blog, cutesycrafts.com, for more fun craft ideas and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss a tutorial.